It was never supposed to be opened, not by her, not by anyone outside a tightly sealed inner circle. Yet somehow, in a moment that would shake the foundation of the monarchy, Princess Anne found herself staring at a document that did not merely suggest change, it confirmed betrayal. The ink was fresh, the authority unmistakable, and the implications unthinkable, because what Anne had just uncovered wasn't preparation for the future. It was a silent transfer of power, already complete. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Princess Anne had spent her entire life inside systems designed to prevent surprises. The monarchy thrived on procedure, on precision, on quiet predictability. Nothing significant happened without layers of preparation and consultation. And yet, on that morning, something had slipped through the carefully guarded architecture of royal secrecy. It began as nothing more than routine. Anne had requested internal estate records, standard verification, the kind she had personally overseen countless times across decades of unwavering service. She had done this before, without hesitation, without fear, and certainly without expectation that anything hidden would reveal itself. But this time, something was different. There was a file she didn't recognize. Its classification marker alone was enough to unsettle her. It carried a restricted sovereign designation rarely used, reserved only for moments of existential urgency, moments when the continuity of the crown itself might be at stake. At first, Anne assumed it was a contingency framework, a procedural safeguard meant to remain dormant unless triggered by crisis. That was how the system worked, silent protections waiting in the shadows. But as she opened the authorization, the world she had trusted with absolute certainty began to shift beneath her feet. Because there, in language unmistakable in its authority, was a declaration that did not anticipate the future, it had already reshaped it. Her eyes locked onto a single name, Catherine. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. Anne read it again, slower this time, hoping she had misunderstood, hoping there was context she had missed. But the words remained unchanged, cold and deliberate. Catherine had been granted sole ownership and control over crown properties that were not symbolic ornaments of prestige, but operational pillars of royal strength. These were not passive inheritances waiting patiently for a distant tomorrow. They were active sources of power, financial independence, control. Anne's pulse slowed, not from calm, but from the terrifying weight of realization settling into place. This wasn't a recommendation. It wasn't a proposal awaiting approval. It was final. Witnessed, authorized, sealed under the king's sovereign command. The authority behind it was absolute. No council debate, no internal discussion, no advisory process. The monarchy's structure had shifted without its guardians even knowing. 1,000 memories rushed through her mind. Every briefing, every meeting, every private conversation where continuity had been treated as sacred and predictable. She had been there. She had listened. She had believed. And yet somehow, the most consequential decision of this era had unfolded without her awareness. The precision of its secrecy was what disturbed her most. This wasn't oversight. It was design. Someone had made certain this would remain invisible, until it was irreversible. Anne felt something unfamiliar tightening in her chest. Not anger, not yet, but something colder. Something more dangerous. Doubt. Because this wasn't simply about Catherine, and it wasn't even about inheritance. It was about timing. The authorization date was recent, painfully recent, which meant, while the monarchy had continued its public rituals of stability, its private architecture had already been rewritten, quietly, permanently. For the first time in her life, Princess Anne found herself questioning not the strength of the crown, but the intentions, moving silently behind it, because whoever had orchestrated this hadn't merely prepared Catherine for a future role. They had ensured she possessed power now, independent, unchallengeable, protected. And as the weight of that truth settled deeper into her thoughts, Anne understood something that made the silence around her feel heavier than ever before. This had never been meant to surface, not until it was too late to stop it. But as Anne's initial shock gave way to a chilling clarity, one question rose above all others, and its answer would expose a secret plan set into motion long before anyone realized the crown itself was already shifting. Kings do not act without reason. Every decision is measured, calculated, and anchored in survival. Yet this was different. There had been no announcement, no consultation, no signal. And yet, months earlier, the king had already begun quietly reshaping the monarchy's physical and financial backbone. What Princess Anne now understood was far more disturbing than a simple transfer. It wasn't reactive, it was strategic. And the true target of this transformation wasn't property, it was the future itself. The document in Anne's hands was not a single act, it was the final piece of something far larger. As she traced the authorization codes, the legal witnesses, and the sovereign seals, she realized this decision had not been born in urgency. It had been built patiently, layer by layer, hidden ins, i.e. ordinary administrative motions that no one would question. What appeared on the surface as routine estate restructuring was in truth a silent dismantling of the old order and the careful construction of a new one. The king had not announced his intentions because he had never planned to. He had allowed the machinery of royal protocol to continue operating as normal, while beneath it, the foundation itself was quietly being redirected. Anne began to examine the dates attached to each authorization, weeks apart, sometimes months, each transfer executed with surgical precision, spaced just far enough to avoid drawing attention. This was not chaos. This was discipline. The properties themselves were not chosen randomly. They were specific, strategic. Each one held operational significance within the monarchy's private structure, places that ensured autonomy, financial resilience, and internal continuity. These were the crown's safeguards against uncertainty. And now, they belonged solely to Catherine. What disturbed Anne most was not just the outcome, but the method. The king had invoked sovereign exemption clauses, ancient legal authorities that existed beyond council review, beyond parliamentary oversight, beyond even the traditional advisory framework that Anne herself had helped preserve for decades. These clauses were rarely used, and when they were, it signaled one thing: absolute intent. This was not a request, it was command. The law itself had bent to accommodate his decision. The deeper Anne looked, the more isolated the process appeared. The legal advisors involved were few, hand-selected, not for rank but for loyalty. Their authorization trails ended abruptly, sealed under confidentiality provisions, so strict they effectively erased the existence of the decision from all but the narrowest circle of awareness. There had been no leaks, no whispers, no resistor, NASE, because there had been no opportunity for resistance to exist. That realization struck Anne harder than anything else. The king had anticipated objection, he had anticipated questions, and he had moved ahead of them all, ensuring that by the time anyone discovered the truth, it would already be too late to challenge. He hadn't waited for succession. He hadn't waited for ceremony. He had acted now, quietly, permanently. This was not preparation for Catherine's future coronation. It was something far more immediate. Catherine's authority no longer depended on an event yet to come. It existed in the present, anchored in property law, shielded by sovereign command, and immune to traditional royal redistribution. She now possessed independent control that could not be undone by debate, politics, or even internal dissent. Anne felt the weight of something irreversible pressing against her thoughts. The monarchy had always operated on continuity, on the slow, visible transfer of responsibility from one generation to the next. But this was different. This was acceleration, a deliberate shift executed ahead of its time. The king had not simply prepared Catherine to inherit the monarchy. He had already ensured she possessed its operational heart. And as Anne followed the timeline further back, examining the earliest authorization dates buried beneath layers of administrative camouflage, a far more unsettling realization began to take shape. This hadn't begun recently. This hadn't been triggered by sudden necessity. It had started long ago, quietly, deliberately, unfolding in silence while the monarchy continued its public performance of stability. And yet, as Anne retraced the timeline of events, a far more unsettling realization emerged. This decision wasn't made recently. It had been unfolding quietly while the entire family stood unaware. Catherine had never asked for power or at least she had never appeared to. She moved with composure, loyalty, and restraint, the perfect future queen. But now, Princess Anne was forced to confront a terrifying possibility. Had Catherine known? Had she silently stepped into a role no one else even realized existed yet? Because if she had accepted these transfers knowingly, then she wasn't just preparing for the future. She was already living inside it. Anne leaned deeper into the implications. Her thoughts no longer focused solely on the king, but on Catherine herself. For years, Catherine had been the embodiment of continuity, calm, careful, and unwavering in her dedication to preserving the monarchy's dignity. She had never overstepped, never demanded authority, never reached for influence beyond what had been gradually entrusted to her. That restraint had earned her trust. It had earned her admiration, and now it raised a question Anne never thought she would be forced to ask. Had Catherine been quietly entrusted with more than anyone realized? Or worse, had she accepted it without ever revealing what she had become? Nothing in Catherine's public presence had changed. She had continued to move through her duties with the same grace, the same quiet discipline that had defined her rise within the royal structure. There had been no announcement, no declaration, no visible shift in her tone or authority. And yet, beneath that familiar exterior, Anne now knew something extraordinary had occurred. Catherine was no longer waiting for the future. The future had already been placed into her hands. Anne began recalling subtle changes she had dismissed at the time. Private briefings. Catherine had attended briefings typically reserved for sovereign authority or those acting directly under sovereign command. It had seemed procedural then, part of gradual preparation. But now, those moments took on a different meaning. They were not preparation. They were activation. Catherine had been allowed into conversations that shaped the monarchy's internal direction, decisions that extended far beyond ceremonial duty, and she had stepped into those spaces without hesitation. Even more unsettling was the quiet expansion of Catherine's internal staff structure. Trusted advisors appearing at her side, administrative roles forming around her with no formal explanation. There had been no public restructuring, no official acknowledgement. Yet somehow, Catherine's operational reach had grown, not visibly, not loudly, but undeniably. And now Anne understood why. The properties transferred to Catherine did not simply grant ownership, they granted independence, financial autonomy, strategic freedom. Catherine now possessed resources that existed beyond traditional allocation, beyond reliance on the king or the crown's central authority. She was no longer bound by the same limitations. She could act, decide, and operate without waiting for succession to formalize her power. Anne's thoughts twisted with conflict. She knew Catherine. She trusted her loyalty. Catherine had never given reason to doubt her devotion to the institution they both served. And yet, this elevation placed her outside the traditional chain of continuity. It created something unprecedented, a parallel axis of authority, not in opposition to the monarchy, but no longer entirely contained within its old structure. That realization unsettled Anne in ways she could not ignore, because this was not merely about Catherine's character, it was about balance, stability, the invisible equilibrium that kept the monarchy unified across generations. And now, that balance had shifted without warning, without consent, without preparation. Anne found herself questioning not Catherine's intentions, but the king's silence. Had Catherine been warned? Had she been chosen and told to remain silent? Or had she, too, discovered this transformation only after it was complete, forced to accept a destiny already decided for her? Because if Catherine knew, it meant the future had been consciously accelerated, and if she didn't, it meant the king had moved pieces across the monarchy's foundation without even informing the one he had empowered most. But as Anne examined the scope of what had been transferred, she realized this wasn't merely symbolic empowerment. It was something far more permanent, far more irreversible. These weren't just homes, they were the physical pillars of royal influence, places where decisions were made, alliances forged, and authority quietly exercised. Each estate carried not just wealth, but legacy and leverage. And now, without announcement or explanation, they belonged to Catherine alone. Princess Anne understood something others did not yet realize. Whoever controlled these properties didn't just inherit land, they inherited control over the monarchy's operational heart. Anne had spent her life understanding the true meaning of royal property. To the outside world, estates were symbols grand, historic, admired. But to those inside the monarchy, they were something far more powerful. They were independence, they were security, they were protection against uncertainty. These properties were not bound by parliamentary negotiation or public funding structures. They existed in a separate realm, one where the crown itself retained absolute discretion. Whoever controlled them possessed something no vote or decree could easily challenge: financial sovereignty. As Anne studied the list of transferred holdings, her concern deepened. These weren't secondary residences or ceremonial retreats. These were operational strongholds, locations historically used not merely for living, but for governing quietly. Decisions had been shaped inside those walls, decisions that influenced not just the royal family, but the stability of the institution itself. And now, Catherine held exclusive authority over them. It was unprecedented. Traditionally, such estates remained under the direct control of the reigning monarch, or were prepared for gradual transition to the immediate heir. They were never reassigned prematurely, never placed entirely outside the sovereign's present control. The logic had always been clear: whoever held the crown must also hold its operational foundation. But that logic had now been disrupted. Anne recognized the implications instantly. These estates generated their own income streams, independent and untouchable. That income wasn't subject to redistribution within royal structures. It wasn't vulnerable to political influence. It couldn't be redirected through internal negotiation. It existed entirely under the authority of its legal owner, Catherine. This wasn't symbolic empowerment. This was infrastructure. Catherine now possessed the means to operate autonomously, to sustain influence, without relying on the king's direct provision. She had been given the ability to stand independently, not in defiance of the crown, but no longer entirely dependent upon it either. Anne's thoughts turned to permanence. Property law did not bend easily, not even for monarchs. Once transferred under sovereign authorization, reversal required extraordinary measures that would risk exposure, controversy, and institutional instability. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. It was structural, enduring. More unsettling still was the strategic nature of the selection. These weren't random gifts. They formed a network, a framework that ensured continuity centered specifically around Catherine. Not just the monarch, why, broadly, not just the line of succession. Catherine herself. The distinction was subtle but devastating in its meaning. This ensured something Anne could not ignore, even if circumstances shifted, even if future transitions unfolded unpredictably. Catherine's authority over these assets would remain intact. She could not simply be bypassed. She could not be quietly diminished. Her position had been anchored in legal reality, not ceremonial promise. For the first time, Anne confronted the terrifying scope of what the king had done. He had not merely strengthened Catherine's future. He had secured her present. He had guaranteed that her influence would exist regardless of timing, regardless of coronation, regardless of anything that might come between now and the monarchy's next chapter. It was a decision that reshaped the crown's internal balance in silence, a decision that ensured continuity, but on terms that only one man had authorized. And as Anne examined the transfer dates more closely, another realization began to emerge. The timing wasn't random. It aligned with something else, something private, something quiet, something that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt impossible to ignore. But Anne's deeper investigation soon uncovered something even more unsettling. The timing of the transfer aligned with a private moment few others knew had ever occurred. There had been a meeting, quiet, unannounced, forgotten by most, but not by Anne. At the time, it had seemed routine. Now, it appeared catastrophic, because that meeting had taken place just days before the first property transfer was authorized. And suddenly, every word spoken in that private room carried new weight. Had the king already decided? Had he already chosen Catherine as the monarchy's true future, while others still believed the path remained unchanged. Anne could still remember the way He had spoken that day. It hadn't been the king's authority that unsettled her, it had been his vulnerability. He had asked for privacy, something he rarely did when discussing matters of institutional continuity. His tone was steady, but beneath it lived something fragile, something burdened. At the time, she had dismissed it as exhaustion, the natural strain of carrying a lifetime of duty. But now, with the evidence sitting heavily in her hands, that conversation returned with chilling clarity. He hadn't been tired. He had been preparing. He had spoken in careful, measured phrases, as though every word carried consequences beyond the moment. He had talked about legacy, not in terms of history, but in terms of survival. He had said the monarchy must be protected beyond his lifetime, not preserved, protected. The distinction had seemed subtle then. Now, it felt seismic. Protection implied threat. Protection implied urgency. Protection implied something was coming that he believed others could not yet see. Anne remembered the pause that had followed those words, a silence filled not with uncertainty, but with decision already made. She had offered her reassurance, her loyalty, as she always had. She had believed she was part of whatever path he intended to follow, but now the truth revealed itself with merciless precision. She had not been included in the decision. She had been informed only enough to prevent suspicion, not enough to alter the outcome. And then there were the advisors. She hadn't thought much of their arrival at the time. Legal consultations were a constant presence in royal life. But now, when she traced the timeline, their appearance took on a different meaning. They had entered shortly after that conversation ended. They had left carrying documents that would quietly reshape the monarchy's internal balance forever. That meeting had not been reflective. It had been operational. The machinery had already begun moving. The timing was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Catherine's quiet expansion of access had begun almost immediately afterward. Briefings opened to her. Administrative pathways cleared. Authority granted without explanation. The sequence was undeniable. The king had not simply envisioned Catherine's future. He had activated it. Anne felt a sharp, unfamiliar pain rising beneath her composure. Not anger, not betrayal in its purest form, but exclusion. She had devoted her entire life to protecting the monarchy's stability, had stood unshaken through every crisis, every transition, every moment of uncertainty. And yet, when the most consequential decision of this era had been made, she had not been called upon to stand beside him. She had been left outside the circle of truth. Why? That question echoed louder than any answer. Because the king had trusted her strength, he had trusted her loyalty. So why had he withheld this? Anne began to consider a possibility more unsettling than a betrayal itself. Fear. Not fear of opposition, but fear of delay. Fear that consultation would slow what he believed needed to happen immediately. His emotional tone during that meeting had not been the confidence of a sovereign secure in his authority. It had been the urgency of a man racing against time, a man who believed hesitation could cost everything. And if that was true, then this transfer was not merely preparation, it was defense. Anne understood then that secrecy itself was the final clue. This had not been done openly because it could not be questioned. It had been done quietly because it could not be risked. The king had acted not to share power, but to secure it before anyone else realized it was moving. And as Anne struggled to reconcile loyalty with truth, the most painful realization of all began to take shape. This wasn't just a transfer, it was a declaration. Princess Anne had spent her entire life protecting the crown. She had never questioned its authority, never doubted its continuity. But now, standing alone with knowledge no one else possessed, she faced an impossible choice. Remain silent and preserve unity, or confront a decision that could fracture the monarchy forever. Because this secret did not merely affect Catherine, it redefined everyone's place, including Anne's own, and threatened to alter the royal balance permanently. For Anne, loyalty had never been a matter of convenience. It was identity. It was purpose. She had lived through transitions that had shaken lesser institutions to their core, had witnessed moments when public confidence trembled and private certainty nearly collapsed. Through it all, she had remained constant. She had been the silent defender, The immovable pillar that ensured continuity never faltered. Her strength was not measured in titles or recognition, but in endurance, in sacrifice, in her unwavering refusal to allow instability to take root. And now, for the first time in her life, stability itself had been quietly redefined without her knowledge. She understood the weight of silence better than anyone. Silence could protect. Silence could preserve. Silence could prevent panic before it began. But silence could also enable. It could allow irreversible decisions to settle into permanence, unchecked and unquestioned. And that was the choice now confronting her. If she said nothing, the king's decision would continue forward without resistance, cementing Catherine's independent authority beyond dispute. If she spoke, she risked unleashing forces that could fracture trust at the monarchy's highest level. Her thoughts turned to Catherine, not as a symbol, not as a future queen, but as a person Anne had watched grow into her role with humility, and restraint. Catherine had never demanded influence. She had never used her position to advance herself. Anne believed that. She trusted it, and yet, trust alone could not erase the consequences of what had been done. Catherine now stood in possession of something no royal consort had ever held before succession itself. Authority that existed outside traditional progression. Authority that could not easily be undone. Anne felt a sharp ache beneath her calm exterior, not born from anger, but from uncertainty. Had the king doubted her? Had he believed she would resist his decision? Had he feared her loyalty to institutional balance might interfere with what he saw as necessary? That possibility wounded her more deeply than any exclusion itself. Because Anne had never resisted the crown, she had protected it, even when protection demanded personal sacrifice. Her mind raced through every possible outcome. If she revealed what she knew, the monarchy's internal unity could shatter, questions would rise, trust would erode, and once doubt entered the institution's foundation, it would never fully disappear. But if she remained silent, she would become a participant in secrecy that altered the monarchy forever. History would not see her intentions. History would see only her silence. The burden of that realization pressed heavily upon her. She understood something few others ever truly grasped. The monarchy's survival depended not on ceremony, but on balance, on invisible agreements, on trust. And now, that balance rested precariously between action and restraint. Anne realized, with painful clarity, that whatever she chose next would define more than her own legacy. It would shape the monarchy's future. Because once power shifted quietly, it rarely shifted back. And yet, just as Anne struggled beneath the weight of decision, another truth began to emerge from the timeline she had uncovered. A truth that did not justify the king's actions, but explained them. But before Anne could decide what to do, one final truth emerged. One that explained why the king had acted when he did. Kings rarely act out of fear, but sometimes fear is the only force strong enough to override tradition itself. And what Anne uncovered next revealed the king's deepest concern, a concern not about power, but about vulnerability. He hadn't transferred the properties because he wanted to. He had done it because he believed he had no choice, because he feared losing control of the monarchy's future if he didn't act immediately. As Anne examined the final layer of authorization records, something subtle but undeniable revealed itself not in the wording, but in the urgency behind it. The dates were too close together, the approvals too swift, the safeguards too absolute. This was not the pace of ceremonial preparation. This was the pace of necessity. And necessity only existed when there was something to outrun. Anne began to understand that this decision had not been born from ambition, but from anticipation. The king had not been securing Catherine's future for convenience. He had been protecting the crown against a future he feared might arrive sooner than anyone expected. His words from that private meeting echoed louder now. Protect the monarchy beyond my lifetime. Not guide it, not preserve it. Protect it. Protection implied threat. And now Anne realized that threat had never been external. It had been uncertainty itself. The monarchy existed on continuity. It depended on predictability, on the seamless transfer of authority across generations. But the king, for reasons he had never fully revealed, had begun to doubt that continuity could be trusted to unfold naturally. Something had shaken his certainty. Something had convinced him that waiting carried risk. And Catherine, in his eyes, had become the answer to that fear. He trusted her, not just her loyalty, but her steadiness, her restraint, her refusal to seek power for its own sake. Catherine represented something rare in royal history: stability without ambition. And that made her, in his mind, the safest guardian of the monarchy's operational foundation. He had not simply chosen her because she would one day wear the crown. He had chosen her because he believed she could carry its weight even before that moment arrived. Anne could see it now. The properties had not been transferred to elevate Catherine above others. They had been transferred to anchor the monarchy around her, ensuring that no matter what unpredictable forces emerged, internal conflict, external pressure, or sudden disruption, the institution would remain grounded in someone he trusted absolutely. This was not about tradition. Tradition moved slowly. Tradition waited. But fear did not wait. Fear demanded action, and the king had acted decisively, bypassing ceremony, bypassing expectation, bypassing even the emotional consequences his decision would leave behind. Anne felt her perception shifting. What had first appeared as betrayal now carried the unmistakable shape of protection. Not protection of ego, not protection of personal legacy, but protection of the crown itself. The king had not been trying to control Catherine. He had been trying to shield the monarchy through her. And yet, even that realization offered no comfort, because protection always came with cost. The secrecy, the exclusion, the irreversible transfer of authority. These were not the choices of a sovereign at peace. They were the choices of a man preparing for a future he could not fully control. Anne found herself asking a question more dangerous than any before. Protection from what? What had the king seen or feared that had driven him to act with such urgency, such finality? Because whatever it was, it had convinced him that the old way of waiting was no longer safe. And yet, even as Anne began to understand his motives, she knew the consequences of this secret were already unfolding, and nothing could stop what came next. It was done, finalized, permanent. The crown's physical power had already shifted, quietly and completely. No announcement could undo it. No confrontation could reverse it without consequences. And now, Princess Anne stood alone with the truth, aware that the monarchy's future had already been decided without consent, without warning. The only question left wasn't whether change had happened, it was whether anyone else would discover it before it was too late. Anne remained motionless in thought, not because she lacked clarity, but because clarity itself had become the burden. There was no misunderstanding left to resolve, no hidden clause waiting to soften the truth. Catherine now possessed something no royal figure in her position had ever held before: independent authority anchored not in promise, but in law. This was not a ceremonial gesture meant to honor the future. This was the future, activated ahead of its time. The king had ensured it with precision, with finality. The monarchy had always depended on sequence, order, the careful, visible progression of responsibility from sovereign to heir. But that sequence had now been bypassed. Catherine's role was no longer defined solely by her place beside the heir. She had been positioned beyond anticipation. Beyond waiting, she held control over the operational pillars that sustained royal continuity. And that control existed regardless of what tomorrow might bring. Anne understood the gravity of what this meant. The traditional pathways that governed succession had not been erased, but they had been reshaped. The center of stability had shifted, not outwardly, not publicly, but internally, where power truly lived. The king had secured Catherine's authority in a way that made it immune to delay, immune to uncertainty, immune even to the unpredictable nature of time itself. And now, Anne faced the most difficult decision of her life: reveal the truth and risk igniting fractures within an institution built on unity, conceal it and become the sole silent witness to a transformation that would define the monarchy long after the present moment passed into history. Neither path offered peace, neither path offered certainty, because once truth existed, it could not be undone, only hidden or revealed. Her thoughts turned once more to Catherine, not with suspicion, but with realization. Catherine's future was no longer vulnerable to circumstance. No external event, no delay, no unexpected shift could strip away what had already been secured. She stood protected within the very structure of the monarchy itself, fortified by decisions made in silence. And perhaps most unsettling of all was how seamlessly it had happened. There had been no disruption, no visible tremor. The monarchy had entered a new era without anyone realizing the moment it began. Anne felt the weight of history pressing forward. One day, this moment would matter more than any coronation, more than any ceremony, because this was where the balance had changed, not in front of crowds, but in private, where the crown's true power had always been shaped. She understood now that her role was no longer simply to protect the monarchy as it had always been. Her role was to protect it as it had become, to carry knowledge few others possessed, to ensure that whatever came next unfolded with the stability the king had fought so fiercely to preserve. The future was no longer uncertain. It had already been secured, and yet uncertain. Why still lingered not about what had happened, but about when its consequences would finally reveal themselves. Because power transferred in silence did not remain silent forever. It waited, it endured, and when the moment came, it reshaped everything. Because in the monarchy, the most powerful decisions are never the ones announced publicly, they are the ones discovered far too late. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.